Welcome to BTC Radio Audiobook and ASMR, the ultimate destination for audiobook enthusiasts and literary explorers. If you're someone who finds solace in the symphony of words, if you yearn to get lost in captivating tales spun by master storytellers, then you've just discovered your haven. Join us on a journey where pages come to life through the power of sound, where every narrative nuance and character emotion is vividly painted in the theater of your mind. From timeless classics to contemporary gems, our channel is a sanctuary for those who believe that stories are meant to be heard. So, sit back, close your eyes, and let the magic of words transport you to distant worlds, one audiobook at a time.
You are listening to continuation of The Secret of Chimneys by British writer Agatha Christie, first published in the UK by the Bodley Head in June 1925, and in the US by Dodd Mead and Company later in the same year. This work is in the public domain in the United States because it was published in 1925. The longest living author of this work died in 1976, so this work is in the public domain in countries and areas where the copyright term is the author's life plus 46 years or less. This work may be in the public domain in countries and areas with longer native copyright terms that apply the rule of the shorter term to foreign works. The Secret of Chimneys by Agatha Christie, Part 2.
Disc 2.
Chapter 6. The Gentle Art of Blackmail. It was exactly 5 minutes to 4 when Virginia Revel, rendered punctual by a healthy curiosity, returned to the house in Pont Street. She opened the door with her latchkey and stepped into the hall to be immediately confronted by the impassive Chilvers. "I beg pardon, ma'am, but a person has called to see you." For the moment, Virginia did not pay attention to the subtle phraseology whereby Chilvers cloaked his meaning. "Mr. Lomax, where is he? In the drawing-room?" "Oh, no, ma'am. Not Mr. Lomax." Chilvers' tone was faintly reproachful. "A person. I was reluctant to let him in, but he said his business was most important, connected with the late captain, I understood him to say. Thinking, therefore, that you might wish to see him, I put him, in the study." Virginia stood thinking for a minute. She had been a widow now for some years, and the fact that she rarely spoke of her husband was taken by some to indicate that below her careless demeanour was a still aching wound. By others it was taken to mean the exact opposite, that Virginia had never really cared for Tim Revel, and that she found it insincere to profess a grief she did not feel. "I should have mentioned, ma'am," continued Chilvers, "that the man appears to be some kind of foreigner." Virginia's interest heightened a little. Her husband had been in the diplomatic service, and they had been together in Slovakia just before the sensational murder of the King and Queen. This man might probably be a Slovakian, some old servant who had fallen on evil days. "You did quite right, Chilvers," she said with a quick, approving nod. "Where did you say you put him? In the study?" She crossed the hall with her light, buoyant step and opened the door of the small room that flanked the dining-room. The visitor was sitting in a chair by the fireplace. He rose on her entrance and stood looking at her. Virginia had an excellent memory for faces, and she was at once quite sure that she had never seen the man before. He was tall and dark, supple in figure, and quite unmistakably a foreigner, but she did not think he was of Slavonic origin. She put him down as Italian, or possibly Spanish. "You wish to see me?" she asked. "I am Mrs. Revel." The man did not answer for a minute or two. He was looking her over slowly, as though appraising her narrowly. There was a veiled insolence in his manner, which she was quick to feel. "Will you please state your business?" she said, with a touch of impatience. "You are Mrs. Revel, Mrs. Timothy Revel." "Yes, I told you so just now." "Quite so. It is a good thing that you consented to see me, Mrs. Revel. Otherwise, as I told your butler, I should have been compelled to do business with your husband." Virginia looked at him in astonishment. But some impulse quelled the retort that sprang to her lips. She contented herself by remarking dryly, "You might have found some difficulty in doing that. I think not. I am very persistent. But I will come to the point. Perhaps you recognize this." He flourished something in his hand. Virginia looked at it without much interest. "Can you tell me what it is, madame?" "It appears to be a letter," replied Virginia, who was by now convinced that she had to do with a man who was mentally unhinged. "And perhaps you know to whom it is addressed," said the man significantly, holding it out to her. "I can read," Virginia informed him pleasantly. "It is addressed to a Captain O'Neill at Rue de Quesnel, No. 15, Paris." The man seemed to be searching her face hungrily for something he did not find. "Will you read it, please?" Virginia took the envelope from him, drew out the enclosure, and glanced at it, but almost immediately she stiffened and held it out to him again. "This is a private letter, certainly not meant for my eyes." The man laughed sardonically. "I congratulate you, Mrs. Revel, on your admirable acting. You play your part to perfection. Nevertheless, I think that you will hardly be able to deny the signature." "The signature?" Virginia turned the letter over and was struck dumb with astonishment. The signature, written in a delicate, slanting hand, was Virginia Revel. Checking the exclamation of astonishment that rose to her lips, she turned again to the beginning of the letter and deliberately read the whole thing through. Then she stood a minute lost in thought. The nature of the letter made it clear enough what was in prospect. "Well, madame," said the man, "that is your name, is it not?" "Oh, yes," said Virginia. "It's my name." But not my handwriting, she might have added. Instead, she turned a dazzling smile upon her visitor. "Supposing," she said sweetly, "we sit down and talk it over." He was puzzled. Not so had he expected her to behave. His instinct told him that she was not afraid of him. "First of all, I should like to know how you found me out." "That was easy." He took from his pocket a page torn from an illustrated paper and handed it to her. Anthony Cade would have recognized it. She gave it back to him with a thoughtful little frown. "I see," she said. "It was very easy." "Of course, you understand, Mrs. Revel, that this is not the only letter. There are others." "Dear me," said Virginia. "I seem to have been frightfully indiscreet." Again, she could see that her light tone puzzled him. She was by now thoroughly enjoying herself. "At any rate," she said, smiling sweetly at him, "it's very kind of you to call and give them back to me." There was a pause as he cleared his throat. "I am a poor man, Mrs. Revel," he said at last, with a good deal of significance in his manner. "As such, you will doubtless find it easier to enter the kingdom of heaven, or so I have always heard. I cannot afford to let you have these letters for nothing." "I think you are under a misapprehension. Those letters are the property of the person who wrote them." "That may be the law, madame, but in this country you have a saying, 'Possession is 9 points of the law,' and, in any case, are you prepared to invoke the aid of the law?" "The law is a severe one for blackmailers," Virginia reminded him. "Come, Mrs. Revel, I am not quite a fool. I have read these letters, the letters of a woman to her lover, one and all breathing dread of discovery by her husband. Do you want me to take them to your husband?" "You have overlooked one possibility. Those letters were written some years ago, supposing that since then I have become a widow." He shook his head with confidence. "In that case, if you had nothing to fear, you would not be sitting there making terms with me." Virginia smiled. "What is your price?" she asked in a businesslike manner. "For £1,000, I will hand the whole packet over to you. It is very little that I am asking there, but you see, I do not like the business." "I shouldn't dream of paying you £1,000, said Virginia with decision. "Madame, I never bargain. £1,000, and I will place the letters in your hands. Virginia reflected. You must give me a little time to think it over. It will not be easy for me to get such a sum together. A few pounds on account, perhaps. Say 50, and I will call again. Virginia looked up at the clock. It was 5 minutes past 4, and she fancied that she had heard the bell. Very well, she said hurriedly. Come back tomorrow, but later than this. About 6. She crossed over to a desk that stood against the wall, unlocked one of the drawers, and took out an untidy handful of notes. There is about £40 here. That will have to do for you. He snatched at it eagerly. And now, go at once, please, said Virginia. He left the room obediently enough. Through the open door, Virginia caught a glimpse of George Lomax in the hall, just being ushered upstairs by Chilvers. As the front door closed, Virginia called to him. Come in here, George. Chilvers, bring us tea in here, will you please? She flung open both windows, and George Lomax came into the room to find her standing erect with dancing eyes and wind-blown hair. I'll shut them in a minute, George, but I felt the room ought to be aired. Did you fall over the blackmailer in the hall? The what? Blackmailer, George. Blackmailer. Blackmailer. One who blackmails. My dear Virginia, you can't be serious. Oh, but I am, George. But who did he come here to blackmail? Me, George. But my dear Virginia, what have you been doing? Well, just for once, as it happens, I haven't been doing anything. The good gentleman mistook me for someone else. Oh, you rang up the police, I suppose? No, I didn't. I suppose you think I ought to have done so. Well, George considered weightily. No, perhaps not. Perhaps you acted wisely. You might be mixed up in some unpleasant publicity in connection with the case. You might even have had to give evidence. Oh, I should have liked that, said Virginia. I would love to be summoned, and I should like to see if judges really do make all the rotten jokes you read about. It would be most exciting. I was at Vine Street the other day to see about a diamond brooch I had lost, and there was the most perfectly lovely inspector, the nicest man I ever met. George, as was his custom, let all irrelevancies pass. But what did you do about this scoundrel? Well, George, I'm afraid I let him do it. Do what? Blackmail me. George's face of horror was so poignant that Virginia had to bite her underlip. You mean... Do I understand you to mean that you did not correct the misapprehension under which he was labouring? Virginia shook her head, shooting a sideways glance at him. Good heavens, Virginia, you must be mad. I suppose it would seem that way to you. But why, in God's name, why? Several reasons. To begin with, he was doing it so beautifully. Blackmailing me, I mean. I hate to interrupt an artist when he's doing his job really well. And then, you see, I've never been blackmailed. I should hope not, indeed. And I wanted to see what it felt like. I am quite at a loss to comprehend you, Virginia. I knew you wouldn't understand. You did not give him money, I hope? Oh, just a trifle, said Virginia apologetically. How much? £40. Virginia! My dear George, it's only what I pay for an evening dress. It's just as exciting to buy a new experience as it is to buy a new dress. More so, in fact. George Lomax merely shook his head, and Chilvers appearing at that moment with the tea-urn, he was saved from having to express his outraged feelings. When tea had been brought in, and Virginia's deft fingers were manipulating the heavy silver teapot, she spoke again on the subject. I had another motive too, George, a brighter and better one. We women are usually supposed to be cats, but at any rate, I'd done another woman a good turn this afternoon. This man isn't likely to go off looking for another Virginia Revel. He thinks he's found his bird all right. Poor little devil. She was in a blue funk when she wrote that letter. Mr. Blackmailer would have had the easiest job in his life there. Now, though he doesn't know it, he's up against a tough proposition. Starting with the great advantage of having led a blameless life, I shall toy with him, to his undoing, as they say in books. Guile, George. Lots of guile. George still shook his head. I don't like it, he said. I don't like it. Well, never mind, George, dear. You didn't come here to talk about blackmailers. What did you come here for, by the way? Correct answer. To see you. Accent on the you, and press her hand with significance, unless you happen to have been eating heavily buttered muffin, in which case it must all be done with the eyes. I did come to see you, replied George seriously, and I'm glad to find you alone. Oh, George, this is so sudden, says she, swallowing a currant. I want to ask a favour of you. I've always considered you, Virginia, as a woman of considerable charm. Oh, George. And also as a woman of intelligence. Not really. How well the man knows me. My dear Virginia, there is a young fellow arriving in England tomorrow whom I should like you to meet. All right, George. But it's your party. Let that be clearly understood. You could, I feel sure, if you chose, exercise your considerable charm. Virginia cocked her head a little on one side. George, dear, I don't charm as a profession, you know. Often I like people, and then, well, they like me. But I don't think I could set out in cold blood to fascinate a helpless stranger. That sort of thing isn't done, George. It really isn't. There are professional sirens who would do it much better than I should. That is out of the question, Virginia. This young man, he's a Canadian, by the way, the name of McGrath. A Canadian of Scottish descent, says she, deducing brilliantly, is probably quite unused to the higher walks of English society. I should like him to appreciate the charm and distinction of a real English gentlewoman. Meaning me? Exactly. Why? I beg your pardon? I said, why? You don't boom the real English gentlewoman with every stray Canadian who sets foot upon our shores. What's the deep idea, George? To put it vulgarly, what do you get out of it? I cannot see that concerns you, Virginia. I couldn't possibly go out for an evening and fascinate unless I knew all the whys and wherefores. You have a most extraordinary way of putting things, Virginia. Anyone would think, wouldn't they? Come on, George, part with a little more information. My dear Virginia, matters are likely to be a little strange shortly in a certain Central European nation. It is important, for reasons which are immaterial, that this Mr. McGrath should be brought to realize that the restoring of the monarchy in Hercule is imperative to the peace of Europe. That part about the peace of Europe is all bosh, said Virginia calmly, but I'm all for monarchies every time, especially for a picturesque people like the Hercule. So, you're running a king in the Hercule stakes, are you? Who is he? George was reluctant to answer, but did not see his way to avoid the question. The interview was not going at all as he had planned. He had foreseen Virginia as a willing, docile tool, receiving his hints gratefully and asking no awkward questions. This was far from being the case. She seemed determined to know all about it, and this George, ever doubtful of female discretion, was determined at all costs to avoid. He had made a mistake. Virginia was not the woman for the part. She might indeed cause serious trouble. Her account of her interview with the blackmailer had caused him grave apprehension. A most undependable creature with no idea of treating serious matters seriously. Prince Michael Abolovitch, he replied, as Virginia was obviously waiting for an answer to her question. But please, let that go no further. Don't be absurd, George. There are all sorts of hints in the papers already, and articles cracking up the Abolovitch dynasty and talking about the murdered Nicholas IV, as though he were a cross between a saint and a hero instead of a stupid little man besotted by a third-rate actress. George winced. He was more than ever convinced that he had made a mistake in enlisting Virginia's aid. He must stave her off quickly. You are right, my dear Virginia, he said hastily, as he rose to his feet to bid her farewell. I should not have made the suggestion I did to you, but we are anxious for the Dominions to see eye to eye with us on this Hercule crisis, and McGrath has, I believe, influence in journalistic circles. As an ardent monarchist, and with your knowledge of the country, I thought it a good plan for you to meet him. So that's the explanation, is it? Yes, but I dare say you wouldn't have cared for him. Virginia looked at him for a second, and then she laughed. George, she said, you're a rotten liar. Virginia. Rotten, absolutely rotten. If I had had your training, I could have managed a better one than that. One that had a chance of being believed. But I shall find out all about it, my poor George, rest assured of that. The mystery of Mr. McGrath. I shouldn't wonder if I got a hint or two at Chimneys this weekend." "At Chimneys? You're going to Chimneys?" George could not conceal his perturbation. He had hoped to reach Lord Caterham in time for the invitation to remain unissued. "Bundle rang up and asked me this morning." George made a last effort. Rather a dull party, I believe," he said. "Hardly in your line, Virginia." "My poor George, why didn't you tell me the truth and trust me? It's still not too late." George took her hand and dropped it again limply. "I have told you the truth," he said coldly, and he said it without a blush. "That's a better one," said Virginia approvingly, "but it's still not good enough. Cheer up, George. I shall be at Chimneys all right, exerting my considerable charm, as you put it. Life has become suddenly very much more amusing. First a blackmailer, and then George in diplomatic difficulties. Will he tell all to the beautiful woman who asks for his confidence so pathetically? No, he will reveal nothing until the last chapter. Goodbye, George. One last fond look before you go. No? Oh, George, dear, don't be sulky about it." Virginia ran to the telephone as soon as George had departed with a heavy gait through the front door. She obtained the number she required and asked to speak to Lady Eileen Brent. "Is that you, Bundle? I'm coming to Chimneys all right tomorrow." "What? Bore me? Oh, no, it won't. Bundle, wild horses wouldn't keep me away, so there." Chapter 7. Mr. McGrath refuses an invitation. The letters were gone. Having once made up his mind to the fact of their disappearance, there was nothing to do but accept it. Anthony realized very well that he could not pursue Giuseppe through the corridors of the Blitz Hotel. To do so was to court undesirable publicity, and in all probability to fail in his object all the same. He came to the conclusion that Giuseppe had mistaken the packet of letters, enclosed as they were in the other wrappings, for the memoirs themselves. It was likely, therefore, that when he discovered his mistake he would make another attempt to get hold of the memoirs. For this attempt Anthony intended to be fully prepared. Another plan that occurred to him was to advertise discreetly for the return of the package of letters. Supposing Giuseppe to be an emissary of the Comrades of the Red Hand, or, which seemed to Anthony more probable, to be employed by the Loyalist party, the letters could have no possible interest for either employer, and he would probably jump at the chance of obtaining a small sum of money for their return. Having thought out all this, Anthony returned to bed and slept peacefully until morning. He did not fancy that Giuseppe would be anxious for a second encounter that night. Anthony got up with his plan of campaign fully thought out. He had a good breakfast, glanced at the papers, which were full of the new discoveries of oil in Czechoslovakia, and then demanded an interview with the manager. And being Anthony Cade, with a gift for getting his own way by means of quiet determination, he obtained what he asked for. The manager, a Frenchman with an exquisitely suave manner, received him in his private office. "You wished to see me, I understand, Mr. McGrath?" "I did. I arrived at your hotel yesterday afternoon, and I had dinner served to me in my own rooms by a waiter, whose name was Giuseppe." He paused. "I dare say we have a waiter of that name," agreed the manager indifferently. "I was struck by something unusual in the man's manner, but thought nothing more of it at the time. Later in the night I was awakened by the sound of someone moving softly about the room. I switched on the light and found this same Giuseppe in the act of rifling my leather suitcase." The manager's indifference had completely disappeared now. "But I have heard nothing of this," he exclaimed. "Why was I not informed sooner?" The man and I had a brief struggle. He was armed with a knife, by the way. In the end he succeeded in making off by way of the window. "What did you do then, Mr. McGrath?" "I examined the contents of my suitcase." "Had anything been taken?" "Nothing of importance," said Anthony slowly. The manager leaned back with a sigh. "I am glad of that," he remarked. "But you will allow me to say, Mr. McGrath, that I do not quite understand your attitude in the matter. You made no attempt to arouse the hotel to pursue the thief?" Anthony shrugged his shoulders. Nothing of value had been taken, as I tell you. I am aware, of course, that, strictly speaking, it is a case for the police. He paused, and the manager murmured without any particular enthusiasm, For the police, of course. In any case, I was fairly certain that the man would manage to make good his escape, and since nothing was taken, why bother with the police? The manager smiled a little. I see that you realize, Monsieur Magrath, that I am not at all anxious to have the police called in. From my point of view, it is always disastrous. If the newspapers can get hold of anything connected with a big, fashionable hotel such as this, they always run it for all it is worth, no matter how insignificant the real subject may be. Quite so, agreed Anthony. Now, I told you that nothing of value had been taken, and that was perfectly true. In a sense, nothing of any value to the thief was taken, but he got hold of something which is of considerable value to me. Ah. Letters, you understand. An expression of superhuman discretion, only to be achieved by a Frenchman, settled down upon the manager's face. I comprehend, he murmured, but perfectly, and naturally. It is not a matter for the police. We are quite agreed upon that point. But you will understand that I have every intention of recovering these letters. In the part of the world where I come from, people are used to doing things for themselves. What I require from you, therefore, is the fullest possible information you can give me about this waiter, Giuseppe. I see no objection to that, said the manager, after a moment or two's pause. I cannot give you the information offhand, of course, but if you will return in half an hour's time, I will have everything ready to lay before you. Well, thank you very much. That will suit me admirably. In half an hour's time, Anthony returned to the office again, to find that the manager had been as good as his word. Jotted down on a piece of paper were all the relevant facts known about Giuseppe Manelli. He came to us, you see, about 3 months ago. A skilled and experienced waiter, has given complete satisfaction. He has been in England about 5 years. Together the two men ran over a list of hotels and restaurants where the Italian had worked. One fact struck Anthony as being possibly of significance. At 2 of the hotels in question, there had been serious robberies during the time that Giuseppe was employed there, though no suspicion of any kind had attached to him in either case. Still, the fact was significant. Was Giuseppe merely a clever hotel thief? Had his search of Anthony's suitcase been only part of his habitual professional tactics? He might just possibly have had the packet of letters in his hand at the moment when Anthony switched on the light and have shoved it into his pocket mechanically so as to have his hands free. In that case, the thing was mere plain or garden robbery. Against that there was to be put the man's excitement of the evening before when he had caught sight of the papers lying on the table. There had been no money or object of value there, such as would excite the cupidity of an ordinary thief. No, Anthony felt convinced that Giuseppe had been acting as a tool for some outside agency. With the information supplied him by the manager, it might be possible to learn something about Giuseppe's private life and so finally track him down. He gathered up the sheet of paper and rose. Thank you very much indeed. It's quite unnecessary to ask, I suppose, whether Giuseppe is still in the hotel. The manager smiled. His bed was not slept in, and all his things have been left behind. He must have rushed straight out after his attack upon you. I don't think there is much chance of our seeing him again. I imagine not. Well, thank you very much indeed. I shall be staying on here for the present. I hope you will be successful in your task, but I confess that I am rather doubtful. I always hope for the best. One of Anthony's first proceedings was to question some of the other waiters who had been friendly with Giuseppe. But he obtained very little to go upon. He wrote out an advertisement on the lines he had planned, and had it sent to 5 of the most widely read newspapers. He was just about to go out and visit the restaurant at which Giuseppe had been previously employed when the telephone rang. Anthony took up the receiver. "Hello? What is it?" A toneless voice replied, "Am I speaking to Mr. Magrath?" "You are? Who are you?" "This is Messrs. Balderson and Hodgkins." "Just a minute, please. I will put you through to Mr. Balderson." Our worthy publishers, thought Anthony. So they're getting worried too, are they? They needn't. There's a week to run still. A hearty voice struck suddenly upon his ear. "Hello? That Mr. McGrath?" "Speaking." "I'm Mr. Balderson of Balderson and Hodgkins. What about that manuscript, Mr. McGrath?" "Well," said Anthony, "what about it?" "Everything about it. I understand, Mr. McGrath, that you've just arrived in this country from South Africa. Now, that being so, you can't possibly understand the position. There's going to be trouble about that manuscript, Mr. McGrath, big trouble. Sometimes I wish we'd never said we'd handle it." "Indeed." "I assure you it's so. At present, I'm anxious to get it into my possession as quickly as possible, so as to have a couple of copies made. Then, if the original is destroyed, well, no harm will be done." "Dear me," said Anthony. "Yes, I expect it sounds absurd to you, Mr. McGrath, but I assure you don't appreciate the situation. There's a determined effort being made to prevent its ever reaching this office. I say to you quite frankly and without humbug that if you attempt to bring it yourself, it's 10 to 1 that you'll never get here." "I doubt that," said Anthony. "When I want to get anywhere, I usually do. You're up against a very dangerous lot of people. I wouldn't have believed it myself a month ago. I tell you, Mr. McGrath, we've been bribed and threatened and cajoled by one lot and another until we don't know whether we're on our heads or our heels. My suggestion is that you do not attempt to bring the manuscript here. One of our people will call upon you at the hotel and take possession of it." "And supposing the gang does him in?" asked Anthony. "The responsibility would then be ours, not yours. You would have delivered it to our representative and obtained a written discharge. The cheque for £1,000, which we are instructed to hand over to you, will not be available until Wednesday next by the terms of our agreement with the executors of the late author. You know whom I mean. But if you insist, I will send my own cheque for that amount by the messenger." Anthony reflected for a minute or two. He had intended to keep the memoirs until the last day of grace, because he was anxious to see for himself what all the fuss was about. Nevertheless, he realized the force of the publisher's arguments. "All right," he said, with a little sigh. "Have it your own way. Send your man along. And if you don't mind sending that cheque as well, I'd rather have it now, as I may be going out of England before next Wednesday." "Certainly, Mr. McGrath. Our representative will call upon you first thing tomorrow morning. It will be wiser not to send anyone direct from the office. Our Mr. Holmes lives in South London. He will call in on his way to us, and will give you a receipt for the package. I suggest that tonight you should place a dummy packet in the manager's safe. Your enemies will get to hear of this, and it will prevent any attack being made upon your apartments tonight." "Very well. I will do as you direct." Anthony hung up the receiver with a thoughtful face. Then he went on with his interrupted plan of seeking news of the slippery Giuseppe. He drew a complete blank, however. Giuseppe had worked at the restaurant in question, but nobody seemed to know anything of his private life or associates. "But I'll get you, my lad," murmured Anthony between his teeth. "I'll get you yet. It's only a matter of time." His second night in London was entirely peaceful. At 9 o'clock the following morning, the card of Mr. Holmes from Messrs. Balderson and Hodgkins was sent up, and Mr. Holmes followed it. A small, fair man with a quiet manner. Anthony handed over the manuscript and received in exchange a cheque for £1,000. Mr. Holmes packed up the manuscript in the small brown bag he carried, wished Anthony good morning, and departed. The whole thing seemed very tame. "But perhaps he'll be murdered on the way there," Anthony murmured aloud as he stared idly out of the window. "I wonder now. I very much wonder." He put the cheque in an envelope, enclosed a few lines of writing with it, and sealed it up carefully. Jimmy, who had been more or less in funds at the time of his encounter with Anthony at Bulawayo, had advanced him a substantial sum of money, which was, as yet, practically untouched. "If one job's done with, the other isn't," said Anthony to himself. "Up to now I've bungled it. But never say die. I think that, suitably disguised, I shall go and have a look at 487 Pont Street." He packed his belongings, went down and paid his bill, and ordered his luggage to be put on a taxi. Suitably rewarding those who stood in his path, most of whom had done nothing whatever materially to add to his comfort, he was on the point of being driven off when a small boy rushed down the steps with a letter. "Just come for you, this very minute, sir." With a sigh, Anthony produced yet another shilling. The taxi groaned heavily and jumped forward with a hideous crashing of gears, and Anthony opened the letter. It was rather a curious document. He had to read it 4 times before he could be sure what it was all about. Put in plain English, the letter was not in plain English, but in the peculiar, involved style common to missives issued by government officials. It presumed that Mr. McGrath was arriving in England from South Africa today, Thursday. It referred obliquely to the memoirs of Count Stilptich, and begged Mr. McGrath to do nothing in the matter until he had had a confidential conversation with Mr. George Lomax, and certain other parties whose magnificence was vaguely hinted at. It also contained a definite invitation to go down to Chimneys as the guest of Lord Caterham on the following day, Friday. A mysterious and thoroughly obscure communication. Anthony enjoyed it very much. "Dear old England," he murmured affectionately. 2 days behind the times, as usual. Rather a pity. Still, I can't go down to Chimneys under false pretences. I wonder, though, if there's an inn handy. Mr. Anthony Cade might stay at the inn without anyone being the wiser. He leaned out of the window and gave new directions to the taxi driver, who acknowledged them with a snort of contempt. The taxi drew up before one of London's more obscure hostelries. The fare, however, was paid on a scale befitting its point of departure. Having booked a room in the name of Anthony Cade, Anthony passed into a dingy writing-room, took out a sheet of notepaper stamped with the legend Hotel Blitz, and wrote rapidly. He explained that he had arrived on the preceding Tuesday, that he had handed over the manuscript in question to Messrs. Balderson and Hodgkins, and he regretfully declined the kind invitation of Lord Caterham, as he was leaving England almost immediately. He signed the letter, "Yours faithfully, James McGrath." "And now," said Anthony, as he affixed the stamp to the envelope, "to business. Exit James McGrath and enter Anthony Cade." Chapter 8. A Dead Man. On that same Thursday afternoon, Virginia Revel had been playing tennis at Ranelagh. All the way back to Pont Street, as she lay back in the long, luxurious limousine, a little smile played upon her lips as she rehearsed her part in the forthcoming interview. Of course, it was within the bounds of possibility that the blackmailer might not reappear, but she felt pretty certain that he would. She had shown herself an easy prey. Well, perhaps this time there would be a little surprise for him. When the car drew up at the house, she turned to speak to the chauffeur before going up the steps. "How's your wife, Walton? I forgot to ask." "Oh, better, I think, Ma'am. The doctor said he'd look in and see her at about 6:30. Will you be wanting the car again?" Virginia reflected for a minute. "I shall be away for the weekend. I'm going by the 6:40 from Paddington, but I shan't need you again. A taxi will do for that. I'd rather you saw the doctor. If he thinks it would do your wife good to go away for the weekend, take her somewhere, Walton. I'll stand the expense." Cutting short the man's thanks with an impatient nod of her head, Virginia ran up the steps, delved into her bag in search of her latchkey, remembered she hadn't got it with her, and hastily rang the bell. It was not answered at once, but as she waited there, a young man came up the steps. He was shabbily dressed, and carried in his hand a sheaf of leaflets. He held one out to Virginia with the legend on it plainly visible, "Why did I serve my country?" In his left hand he held a collecting box. "I can't buy 2 of those awful poems in one day," said Virginia pleadingly. "I bought one this morning. I did, indeed, honour bright." The young man threw back his head and laughed. Virginia laughed with him. Running her eyes carelessly over him, she thought him a more pleasing specimen than the usual of London's unemployed. She liked his brown face and the lean hardness of him. She went so far as to wish she had a job for him. But at that moment the door opened, and immediately Virginia forgot all about the problem of the unemployed, for to her astonishment the door was opened by her own maid, Elise. "Where's Chilvers?" she demanded sharply, as she stepped into the hall. "But he is gone, madame, with the others." "What others? Gone where?" "But to Datchet, madame, to the cottage, as your telegram said." "My telegram?" said Virginia, utterly at sea. "Did not madame send a telegram? Surely there can be no mistake. It came but an hour ago." "I never sent any telegram. What did it say?" "I believe it is still on the table, là-bas." Elise retired, pouncing upon it, and brought it to her mistress in triumph. "Voilà, madame!" The telegram was addressed to Chilvers, and ran as follows: "Please take household down to cottage at once, and make preparations for weekend party there. Catch 5:49 train." There was nothing unusual about it. It was just the sort of message she herself had frequently sent before, when she had arranged a party at her riverside bungalow on the spur of the moment. She always took the whole household down, leaving an old woman as caretaker. Chilvers would not have seen anything wrong with the message, and, like a good servant, had carried out his orders faithfully enough. "Me, I remained," explained Elise, "knowing that Madame would wish me to pack for her." "It's a silly hoax," cried Virginia, flinging down the telegram angrily. "You know perfectly well, Elise, that I'm going to Chimneys. I told you so this morning." "I thought Madame had changed her mind. Sometimes that does happen, does it not, Madame?" Virginia admitted the truth of the accusation with a half-smile. She was busy trying to find a reason for this extraordinary practical joke. Elise put forward a suggestion. "Mon Dieu!" she cried, clasping her hands. "If it should be the malefactors, the thieves, they send the bogus telegram and get the domestique all out of the house, and then they'll rob it." "I suppose that might be it," said Virginia doubtfully. Yes, madame. That is, without a doubt. Every day you read in the papers of such things. Madame will ring up the police at once, before they arrive and cut our throats." "Don't get so excited, Elise. They won't come and cut our throats at 6 o'clock in the afternoon." "Madame, I implore you, let me run out and fetch a policeman now, at once." "What on earth for?" "Don't be silly, Elise. Go and pack my things for Chimneys, if you haven't already done it. The new Caillot evening dress, and the white crepe moroccaine, and, yes, the black velvet. Black velvet is so political, is it not?" "Madame looks ravishing in the eau de Nil satin," suggested Elise, her professional instincts reasserting themselves. "No, I won't take that. Hurry up, Elise, there's a good girl. We've got very little time. I'll send a wire to Chilvers at Datchet, and I'll speak to the policeman on the beat as we go out and tell him to keep an eye on the place. Don't start rolling your eyes again, Elise. If you get so frightened before anything has happened, what would you do if a man jumped out from some dark corner and stuck a knife into you?" Elise gave vent to a shrill squeak and beat a speedy retreat up the stairs, darting nervous glances over her shoulder as she went. Virginia made a face at her retreating back and crossed the hall to the little study where the telephone was. Elise's suggestion of ringing up the police station seemed to her a good one, and she intended to act upon it without any further delay. She opened the study door and crossed to the telephone. Then, with her hand on the receiver, she stopped. A man was sitting in the big armchair, sitting in a curious, huddled position. In the stress of the moment she had forgotten all about her expected visitor. Apparently he had fallen asleep whilst waiting for her. She came right up to the chair, a slightly mischievous smile upon her face, and then, suddenly, the smile faded. The man was not asleep. He was dead. She knew it at once, knew it instinctively, even before her eyes had seen and noted the small, shining pistol lying on the floor, the little singed hole just above the heart with the dark stain round it, and the horrible dropped jaw. She stood quite still, her hands pressed to her sides. In the silence she heard Elise running down the stairs. "Madame! Madame!" "Well, what is it?" She moved quickly to the door. Her whole instinct was to conceal what had happened, for the moment anyway, from Elise. Elise would promptly go into hysterics, she knew that well enough, and she felt a great need for calm and quiet in which to think things out. "Madame, would it not be better if I should draw the chain across the door? These malefactors, at any minute they may arrive." "Yes, if you like. Anything you like." She heard the rattle of the chain, and then Elise running upstairs again, and drew a long breath of relief. She looked at the man in the chair, and then at the telephone. Her course was quite clear. She must ring up the police at once. But still, she did not do so. She stood quite still, paralyzed with horror, and with a host of conflicting ideas rushing through her brain. The bogus telegram. Had it something to do with this? Supposing Elise had not stayed behind? She would have let herself in, that is, presuming she had had her latchkey with her as usual, to find herself alone in the house with a murdered man. a man whom she had permitted to blackmail her on a former occasion. Of course, she had an explanation of that, but thinking of that explanation, she was not quite easy in her mind. She remembered how frankly incredible George had found it. Would other people think the same? Those letters now. Of course she hadn't written them, but would it be so easy to prove that? She put her hands on her forehead, squeezing them tight together. "I must think," said Virginia. "I simply must think. Who had let the man in? Surely not Elise. If she had done so, she would have been sure to have mentioned the fact at once. The whole thing seemed more and more mysterious as she thought about it. There was really only one thing to be done. Ring up the police. She stretched out her hand to the telephone, and suddenly she thought of George, a man. That was what she wanted, an ordinary, level-headed, unemotional man who would see things in their proper proportion and point out to her the best course to take. Then she shook her head. Not George. The first thing George would think of would be his own position. He would hate being mixed up in this kind of business. George wouldn't do at all. Then her face softened. Bill, of course. Without more ado, she rang up Bill. She was informed that he had left half an hour ago for Chimneys. "Oh, damn," cried Virginia, jamming down the receiver. It was horrible to be shut up with a dead body and to have no one to speak to. And at that minute, the front doorbell rang. Virginia jumped. In a few minutes, it rang again. Elise, she knew, was upstairs packing and wouldn't hear it. Virginia went out into the hall, drew back the chain, and undid all the bolts that Elise had fastened in her zeal. Then, with a long breath, she threw the door open. On the steps was the unemployed young man. Virginia plunged headlong with the relief born of overstrung nerves. "Come in," she said. "I think perhaps I've got a job for you." She took him into the dining room, pulled forward a chair for him, sat herself facing him, and stared at him very attentively. "Excuse me," she said, "but are you— I mean, Eton and Oxford," said the young man. "That's what you wanted to ask me, wasn't it?" "Something of the kind," admitted Virginia. "Come down in the world entirely through my own incapacity to stick to regular work. This isn't regular work you're offering me, I hope?" A smile hovered for a moment on her lips. "It's very irregular." "Good," said the young man, in a tone of satisfaction. Virginia noted his bronzed face and long, lean body with approval. "You see," she explained, "I'm in rather a hole, and most of my friends are, well, rather high up. They've all got something to lose. I've nothing whatever to lose. So go ahead. What's the trouble?" "There's a dead man in the next room," said Virginia. "He's been murdered, and I don't know what to do about it." She blurted out the words as simply as a child might have done. The young man went up enormously in her estimation by the way he accepted her statement. He might have been used to hearing a similar announcement made every day of his life. "Excellent," he said, with a trace of enthusiasm. "I've always wanted to do a bit of amateur detective work. Shall we go and view the body, or will you give me the facts first?" "I think I'd better give you the facts." She paused for a moment to consider how best to condense her story, and then began speaking quietly and concisely. "This man came to the house for the first time yesterday and asked to see me. He had certain letters with him, love letters, signed with my name." "But which weren't written by you," put in the young man quietly. Virginia looked at him in some astonishment. "How did you know that?" "Oh, I deduced it. But go on." "He wanted to blackmail me, and I don't know if you'll understand, but I let him." She looked at him appealingly, and he nodded his head reassuringly. "Oh, of course, I understand. You wanted to see what it felt like." "How frightfully clever of you. That's just what I did feel." "I am clever," said the young man modestly, "but mind you, very few people would understand that point of view. Most people, you see, haven't got any imagination." "I suppose that's so. I told this man to come back today at 6 o'clock. I arrived home from Ranelagh to find that a bogus telegram had got all the servants except my maid out of the house. Then I walked into the study, and found the man shot. Who let him in? I don't know. I think if my maid had done so, she would have told me. Does she know what has happened? I've told her nothing. The young man nodded and rose to his feet. And now, to view the body, he said briskly. But I'll tell you this. On the whole, it's always best to tell the truth. One lie involves you in such a lot of lies, and continuous lying is so monotonous. Then you advise me to ring up the police? Probably. But we'll just have a look at the fellow first. Virginia led the way out of the room. On the threshold, she paused, looking back at him. By the way, she said, you haven't told me your name yet. My name? My name's Anthony Cade. Chapter 9. Anthony disposes of a body. Anthony followed Virginia out of the room, smiling a little to himself. Events had taken quite an unexpected turn. But as he bent over the figure in the chair, he grew grave again. He's still warm, he said sharply. He was killed less than half an hour ago. Just before I came in. Exactly. He stood upright, drawing his brows together in a frown. Then he asked a question of which Virginia did not at once see the drift. Your maid's not been in this room, of course? No. Does she know that you've been into it? Why, yes, I came to the door to speak to her. After you'd found the body? Yes. And you said nothing? Would it have been better if I had? I thought she would go into hysterics. She's French, you know, and easily upset. I wanted to think over the best thing to do. Anthony nodded, but did not speak. You think it a pity, I can see. Well, it was rather unfortunate, Mrs. Revel. If you and the maid had discovered the body together immediately on your return, it would have simplified matters very much. The man would then definitely have been shot before your return to the house, whilst now they might say he was shot after. I see. He watched her taking in the idea, and was confirmed in his first impression of her formed when he had spoken to her on the steps outside. Besides beauty, she possessed courage and brains. Virginia was so engrossed in the puzzle presented to her that it did not occur to her to wonder at this strange man's ready use of her name. Why didn't Elise hear the shot, I wonder? She murmured. Anthony pointed to the open window, as a loud backfire came from a passing car. There you are. London's not the place to notice a pistol shot. Virginia turned with a little shudder to the body in the chair. He looks like an Italian, she remarked curiously. He isn't Italian, said Anthony. I should say that his regular profession was that of a waiter. He only did blackmailing in his spare time. His name might very possibly be Giuseppe. Good heavens, cried Virginia. Is this Sherlock Holmes? No, said Anthony regretfully. I'm afraid it's just plain or garden cheating. I'll tell you all about it presently. Now, you say this man showed you some letters and asked you for money. Did you give him any? Yes, I did. How much? £40. That's bad, said Anthony, but without manifesting any undue surprise. Now, let's have a look at the telegram. Virginia picked it up from the table and gave it to him. She saw his face grow grave as he looked at it. What's the matter? He held it out, pointing silently to the place of origin. Barnes, he said. And you were at Ranelagh this afternoon. What's to prevent you having sent it off yourself? Virginia felt fascinated by his words. It was as though a net was closing tighter and tighter round her. He was forcing her to see all the things which she had felt dimly at the back of her mind. Anthony took out his handkerchief and wound it round his hand. Then he picked up the pistol. We criminals have to be so careful, he said apologetically. Fingerprints, you know. Suddenly, she saw his whole figure stiffen. His voice, when he spoke, had altered. It was terse and curt. Mrs. Revel, he said, have you ever seen this pistol before? No, said Virginia wonderingly. Are you sure of that? Quite sure. Have you a pistol of your own? No. Have you ever had one? No, never. You're sure of that? Quite sure. He stared at her steadily for a minute, and Virginia stared back in complete surprise at his tone. Then, with a sigh, he relaxed. "That's odd," he said. "How do you account for this?" He held out the pistol. It was a small, dainty article, almost a toy, though capable of doing deadly work. Engraved on it was the name Virginia. "Oh, it's impossible!" cried Virginia. Her astonishment was so genuine that Anthony could but believe in it. "Sit down," he said quietly. "There's more in this than there seemed to be. First go off. To begin with, what's our hypothesis? There are only two possible ones. There is, of course, the real Virginia of the letters. She may have somehow or other tracked him down, shot him, dropped the pistol, stolen the letters, and taken herself off. That's quite possible, isn't it?" "I suppose so," said Virginia unwillingly. "The other hypothesis is a good deal more interesting. Whoever wished to kill Giuseppe wished also to incriminate you. In fact, that may have been their main object. They could get him easily enough anywhere, but they took extraordinary pains and trouble to get him here. And whoever they were, they knew all about you, your cottage at Datchet, your usual household arrangements, and the fact that you were at Ranelagh this afternoon. It seems an absurd question, but have you any enemies, Mrs. Revel?" "Of course I haven't. Not that kind, anyway." "The question is," said Anthony, "what are we going to do now? There are two courses open to us. A, ring up the police, tell the whole story, and trust to your unassailable position in the world and your hitherto blameless life. B, an attempt on my part to dispose successfully of the body. Naturally, my private inclinations urge me to B. I've always wanted to see if I couldn't conceal a crime with the necessary cunning, but have had a squeamish objection to shedding blood. On the whole, I expect A's the soundest. Then here's a sort of Bowdlerized A. Ring up the police, etc., but suppress the pistol and the blackmailing letters. That is, if they're still on him." Anthony ran rapidly through the dead man's pockets. "He's been stripped clean," he announced. "There's not a thing on him. There'll be dirty work at the crossroads over those letters yet. Hello, what's this? Hole in the lining. Something got caught there, torn roughly out, and a scrap of paper left behind." He drew out the scrap of paper as he spoke, and brought it over to the light. Virginia joined him. "Pity we haven't the rest of it," he muttered. "Chimneys, 11:45 Thursday. Sounds like an appointment." "Chimneys?" cried Virginia. "How extraordinary." "Why extraordinary? Rather high-toned for such a low fellow?" "I'm going to Chimneys this evening. At least I was." Anthony wheeled round on her. "What's that? Say that again." "I was going to Chimneys this evening," repeated Virginia. Anthony stared at her. "I begin to see. At least, I may be wrong, but it's an idea. Suppose someone wanted badly to prevent your going to Chimneys." "My cousin George Lomax does," said Virginia with a smile, "but I can't seriously suspect George of murder." Anthony did not smile. He was lost in thought. "If you ring up the police, it's goodbye to any idea of getting to Chimneys today or even tomorrow. And I should like you to go to Chimneys. I fancy it will disconcert our unknown friends. Mrs. Revel, will you put yourself in my hands?" "It's to be Plan B, then?" "It's to be Plan B. The first thing is to get that maid of yours out of the house. Can you manage that?" "Easily." Virginia went out into the hall and called up the stairs. "Elise! Elise! Madame!" Anthony heard a rapid colloquy, and then the front door opened and shut. Virginia came back into the room. "She's gone. I sent her for some special scent. Told her the shop in question was open until 8. It won't be, of course. She's to follow after me by the next train without coming back here." "Good," said Anthony approvingly. "We can now proceed to the disposal of the body. It's a time-worn method, but I'm afraid I shall have to ask you if there's any such thing in the house as a trunk." "Well, of course there is. Come down to the basement and take your choice." There was a variety of trunks in the basement. Anthony selected a solid affair of suitable size. "I'll attend to this part of it," he said tactfully. "You go upstairs and get ready to start." Virginia obeyed. She slipped out of her tennis kit, put on a soft brown travelling dress and a delightful little orange hat, and came down to find Anthony waiting in the hall, with a neatly strapped trunk beside him. "I should like to tell you the story of my life," he remarked, "but it's going to be a rather busy evening. Now, this is what you've got to do. Call a taxi, have your luggage put on it, including the trunk. Drive to Paddington. There, have the trunk put in the left luggage office. I shall be on the platform. As you pass me, drop the left luggage ticket. I will pick it up and return it to you, but in reality I shall keep it. Go on to Chimneys and leave the rest to me." "It's awfully good of you," said Virginia. "It's really dreadful of me saddling a perfect stranger with a dead body like this." "I like it," returned Anthony nonchalantly. "If one of my friends, Jimmy McGrath, were here, he'd tell you that anything of this kind suits me down to the ground." Virginia was staring at him. "What name did you say?" "Jimmy McGrath?" Anthony returned her glance keenly. "Yes. Why? Have you heard of him?" "Yes, and quite lately." She paused irresolutely, and then went on. "Mr. Cade, I must talk to you. Can't you come down to Chimneys?" "You'll see me before very long, Mrs. Revel. I'll tell you that. Now, exit Conspirator A by back door slinkingly. Exit Conspirator B in blaze of glory by front door to taxi." The plan went through without a hitch. Anthony, having picked up a second taxi, was on the platform and duly retrieved the fallen ticket. He then departed in search of a somewhat battered second-hand Morris Cowley, which he had acquired earlier in the day in case it should be necessary to his plans. Returning to Paddington in this, he handed the ticket to the porter, who got the trunk out of the cloakroom and wedged it securely at the back of the car. Anthony drove off. His objective was now out of London, through Notting Hill, Shepherd's Bush, down Goldhawk Road, through Brentford and Hounslow, till he came to the long stretch of road midway between Hounslow and Staines. It was a well-frequented road, with motors passing continuously. No footmarks or tyre marks were likely to show. Anthony stopped the car at a certain spot. Getting down, he first obscured the number plate with mud. Then, waiting until he heard no car coming in either direction, he opened the trunk, heaved out Giuseppe's body, and laid it neatly down by the side of the road, on the inside of a curve, so that the headlights of passing motors would not strike it. Then he entered the car again and drove away. The whole business had occupied exactly 1 minute and a half. He made a detour to the right, returning to London by way of Burnham Beeches. There again he halted the car, and choosing a giant of the forest, he deliberately climbed the huge tree. It was something of a feat, even for Anthony. To one of the topmost branches he affixed a small brown paper parcel, concealing it in a little niche close to the bowl. "A very clever way of disposing of the pistol," said Anthony to himself with some approval. "Everybody hunts about on the ground and drags ponds. There are very few people in England who could climb that tree." Next, back to London and Paddington Station. Here he left the trunk, at the other left luggage office this time, the one on the arrival side. He thought longingly of such things as good rump steaks, juicy chops, and large masses of fried potatoes, but he shook his head ruefully, glancing at his wristwatch. He fed the Morris with a fresh supply of petrol, and then took the road once more. North, this time. It was just after 11:30 that he brought the car to rest in the road adjoining the park of Chimneys. Jumping out, he scaled the wall easily enough and set out towards the house. It took him longer than he thought, and presently he broke into a run. A great grey mass loomed up out of the darkness, the venerable pile of Chimneys. In the distance, a stable clock chimed the 3/4. 11:45, the time mentioned on the scrap of paper. Anthony was on the terrace now, looking up at the house. Everything seemed dark and quiet. "They go to bed early, these politicians," he murmured to himself. And suddenly a sound smote upon his ears, the sound of a shot. Anthony spun round quickly. The sound had come from within the house, he was sure of that. He waited a minute, but everything was still as death. Finally, he went up to one of the long French windows from where he judged the sound that had startled him had come. He tried the handle. It was locked. He tried some of the other windows, listening intently all the while. but the silence remained unbroken. In the end, he told himself that he must have imagined the sound, or perhaps mistaken a stray shot coming from a poacher in the woods. He turned and retraced his steps across the park, vaguely dissatisfied and uneasy. He looked back at the house, and whilst he looked, a light sprang up in one of the windows on the first floor. In another minute it went out again, and the whole place was in darkness once more. Chapter 10. Chimneys. Inspector Badgeworthy in his office. Time, 8:30 a.m. A tall, portly man, Inspector Badgeworthy, with a heavy regulation tread, inclined to breathe hard in moments of professional strain. In attendance, Constable Johnson, very new to the force, with a downy, unfledged look about him, like a human chicken. The telephone on the table rang sharply, and the inspector took it up with his usual portentous gravity of action. "Yes? Police station, Market Basing? Inspector Badgeworthy speaking?" "What?" Slight alteration in the inspector's manner. As he is greater than Johnson, so others are greater than Inspector Badgeworthy. "Speaking, my lord. I beg your pardon, my lord. I didn't quite hear what you said." Long pause, during which the inspector listens, quite a variety of expressions passing over his usually impassive countenance. Finally, he lays down the receiver, after a brief, "At once, my lord." He turned to Johnson, seeming visibly swelled with importance. "From his lordship at Chimneys. Murder." "Murder?" echoed Johnson, suitably impressed. "Murder it is," said the inspector with great satisfaction. "Why, there's never been a murder here, not that I've ever heard of, except that time that Tom Pierce shot his sweetheart." "And that, in a manner of speaking, wasn't murder at all, but drink," said the inspector deprecatingly. "He weren't hanged for it," said Johnson gloomily. "But this is the real thing, is it, sir?" "It is, Johnson. One of his lordship's guests, a foreign gentleman, discovered shot. Open window and footprints outside." "I'm sorry it were a foreigner," said Johnson, with some regret. It made the murder seem less real. Foreigners, Johnson felt, were liable to be shot. "His lordship's in a rare taking," continued the inspector. "We'll get hold of Dr. Cartwright, take him up with us right away. I hope to goodness no one will get messing with those footprints." Badgeworthy was in seventh heaven. A murder. At Chimneys. Inspector Badgeworthy in charge of the case. The police have a clue. Sensational arrest, promotion and kudos for the aforementioned inspector. "That is," said Inspector Badgeworthy to himself, "if Scotland Yard doesn't come butting in." The thought damped him momentarily. It seemed so extremely likely to happen under the circumstances. They stopped at Dr. Cartwright's, and the doctor, who was a comparatively young man, displayed a keen interest. His attitude was almost exactly that of Johnson. "Why, bless my soul," he exclaimed, "we haven't had a murder here since the time of Tom Pierce." All three of them got into the doctor's little car and started off briskly for Chimneys. As they passed the local inn, the Jolly Cricketers, the doctor noticed a man standing in the doorway. "Stranger," he remarked. "Rather a nice-looking fellow. Wonder how long he's been here, and what he's doing, staying at the Cricketers. I haven't seen him about at all. He must have arrived last night." "He didn't come by train," said Johnson. Johnson's brother was the local railway porter, and Johnson was therefore always well up in arrivals and departures. "Who was here for Chimneys yesterday?" asked the inspector. "Lady Eileen. She come down by the 3:40, and two gentlemen with her, an American gent and a young army chap, neither of them with valets. His lordship came down with a foreign gentleman, the one that's been shot as likely as not, by the 5:40, and the foreign gentleman's valet. Mr. Eversley came by the same train. Mrs. Revel came by the 7:25, and another foreign-looking gentleman came by it too, one with a bald head and hook nose. Mrs. Revel's maid came by the 8:56. Johnson paused, out of breath. "And there was no one for the Cricketers?" Johnson shook his head. "He must have come by car, then," said the inspector. "Johnson, make a note to institute inquiries at the Cricketers on your way back. We want to know all about any strangers. He was very sunburnt, that gentleman. Likely as not, he's come from foreign parts too. The inspector nodded his head with great sagacity, as though to imply that that was the sort of wide-awake man he was, not to be caught napping under any consideration.
End of Disc 2.
This is end of part 2. There are 7 parts of this audiobook. Please click on the link on the screen to listen to part 3 of 7.